be going in detail to talk about the Tuskegee experiment, step by step. So, as as time goes on, it gets to the point where African American doctors, okay, they begin to refuse to believe that these black diseases were only affecting black people. It doesn't make sense, right? Because black physicians were increasing in numbers as well. And they begin to establish hospitals themselves. See, we have to learn from history. We are seeing how, our ancestors evolve. They begin to create their own hospitals. They did not wait for the government in Africa. They came together and create their own things. So as Africans in this group, I'm sorry, I'm digressing for a second. We have to begin to create our own, because we know that there is an agenda to mess the whole continent up. So we have to begin to think about ways that we can create for ourselves and empower ourselves if we want to get out of this. Okay, moving on. So in 1893, there was a surgeon named Daniel Hale Williams. And he rose to the challenge and opened the first non-segregated hospital in Chicago called Providence Hospital. Dr. Daniel Hale Williams also performed the first open heart surgery that was successful in America, okay, in 1897. Dr. Orlando McLaren opened a hospital and nurse training school. And by 1916, Dr. Matilda Evans of South Carolina opened 3 different hospitals there. Okay? Eventually, 7 African American medical schools were also opened to enhance the African American population. Okay? To become doctors. But the enemy is always awake and watching. So in 1910, a single research report failed the schools. Not only that, but also in 1908, the Carnegie Foundation, for the advancement of teaching, invited the influential Dr. Abraham Flexner, to write a report and critique the nation's 147 medical schools in the country. When Flexner's report was published 2 years later, it destroyed all the medical schools that were owned by African Americans, except for 2. Only Howard and Meharry medical schools survived. So because of this report, it was impossible for the other African American medical schools to get funding from the government. And this is just to show you how racism is fully embedded in the fabric of the governmental structure, and how they can use government policies to sabotage whatever you are trying to do as an African American. So by 1924, only Howard Medical School and Meharry Medical School remained open. They were owned by blacks. There is a book called A Century of Black Surgeons. It is quite expensive. You may find it on Amazon. Last I checked, it was like $700. Excuse me. It breaks all of these medical challenges down. And also, you can also check the history of the Negro in medicine on Amazon as well. I think it's like $20. So because white America was seeing progress African Americans were making in the medical field, some decide to come in disguise to help at the time. These were socially conscious white American organizations, and it includes physicians and leaders of institutions as well, such as Metropolitan Life and leaders of North Carolina Life as well. And it came in the guise of supporting black health programs. It wasn't too long before private philanthropies came on board as well, like the Rockefeller Foundation and the Julius Rosenwald Fund. The Rosenwald Fund decided to focus its attention on infectious diseases affecting the blacks, and they did so by initiating syphilis control programs in Macon County, Alabama, the home of Tuskegee University. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service inaugurated its study of syphilis on the untreated Negro male, Tuskegee Syphilis Study, and promised to give free medical care to about 600 desperately poor sharecroppers in Macon County, Alabama. And mind you, these sharecroppers, these are black Americans who owned their land but did not have the resources and tools needed to farm the land and harvest successfully. So, in turn, they decided to go in business with white America. Okay? But if you are to put it in today's terms, it was more or less like a 90-10% ratio. The white people will get like 90% of the profit, and the blacks will get like 10% or less. Okay? In terms of sharing the profit. Because but we'll touch on that later. So the syphilis study itself was designed to study the progression of syphilis in black men, because scientists had a claim that the progression of syphilis manifested differently in blacks than in white people. So they decided to find these black men, put them all in a hospital, and they refused to give them the right treatment for the disease itself. And basically what they were doing was charting. They were charting the progression of the disease itself. So it was kind of like if you had COVID and you go to the hospital, and instead of them giving you treatment for the symptoms you are facing, they put you in the hospital and they give you aspirin and act like they are treating you, but they are really not treating you at all, you know. Maybe now you can begin to understand why some black people are skeptical when it comes to medical treatment in the Americas. But they lie to these 600 men that they are treating them, but they were studying the men. Whenever the men died, these physician researchers, will autopsy the men in order to trace precisely the ravaging of the disease itself in their bodies. That is all they were concerned about. All they were trying to do was to put a strong foundation on their claim of racial dimorphism. In other words, they were trying to validate syphilis, that it is a black disease and that it is affecting blacks a certain kind of way, even though syphilis was ravaging the white population as well, because it was affecting the neurological system of whites in their brains, but at the same time affecting the cardiovascular system of black people, sparing their relatively primitive, underdeveloped brains of the black people, according to doctors at that time. Now, let's backtrack for a second, because in 1898, when Booker T. Washington, who is the founder of Tuskegee Institute, when he met this wealthy philanthropist, Rosenwald, who was the founder of Sears, and Roebuck and Company as well, they end up becoming good friends because they were both mutually impressed at each other's works. So, long story short, Rosenwald had some pull in Washington. He knows some people. So they planned a program to provide medical treatment for Macon County, Alabama. And by that time, slavery had ended in Macon County, Alabama. Well, at least on paper, okay? By 1932, 82% of Macon, Alabama's residents were black, and half of them were far below the poverty line. The median income was $1 a day, even though most of them were sharecroppers, but they were always in debt by the white folks. So basically, they were trapped in the cycle and forced to work the same land as their enslaved grandparents were. These sharecroppers, including children, were weighed down, 100 pounds of bags of cotton, living and working under the orders of white landowners, who kept them in economic fraud by paying very low prices for their crops and charging them inflated prices for food, for seeds, and other necessities. The same thing they're doing in Africa right now, okay? Those African Americans, whenever they try to flee the land, okay, they will get arrested, punished, and returned back to the land. Some were even lynched, okay, or beaten. Sometimes those murders were not even investigated. And also the schools were segregated, okay, and poorly equipped with only few teachers. And at the time, most families were almost unable to spare to send their children to go to school and learn to read and write well, because they had to toil the land. And illness was rampant, okay, because medical care was not existing for most of them. Around that same time, 15 of the 16 doctors in Macon County were white, and only one was black. And the one black doctor will sometimes see patients on a trade-in basis, barter system. These patients will bring chickens and greens, whatever the doctor needs, collard greens, whatever the patients can spare, okay? Because the rest of the other doctors wanted their fee in cash, okay, plus $1 a mile if they have to travel. Because of this, poor nutrition, lack of decent housing, and rampant infectious diseases from malaria to tuberculosis to syphilis haunted the sharecroppers of Macon County, Alabama. So, in 1929, there was a syphilis survey of blacks Alabama residents commissioned by Dr. Taliaferro Clark, who was chief of the Venereal Disease Division. And it was determined that according to the survey, that Macon County had a high rate of 46% of infection. But there were other counties as well who had higher rates. But because the John A. Andrews Veteran Hospital was there and the Tuskegee Institute was also there, they decided to use Macon County for the Tuskegee experiment. Now let's talk about syphilis for a second. Syphilis itself is a very serious disease, okay? The disease itself is caused by a type of bacterial infection organism named Treponema pallidum. They are named for their spiral shape, and under a microscope, they are worm-like bacteria and they wiggle furiously. T. pallidum can be acquired from sexual activity through braces and cuts, or congenitally through the mother. In the initial stage, a hard painless sore appears on the genitals or other points of entry, followed by flu-like symptoms, and if the disease is not treated, it entered a secondary stage before emerging to inflict an assortment of skin growth and running sores. Man, I'm describing it like I got it. Okay, let me move on. That was okay. Anyway, bone decay and heart damage as well. And then the final tertiary stage of it will erupt several decades later, causing profound neurological damage like blindness, insanity, paralysis, and death. Sometimes it will take up to 30 years before it gets to its tertiary stages. Okay? And before it gets to its tertiary stage, think about the mental illness also. Okay? But eventually, antibiotics and penicillin was discovered to cure it. So, let's backtrack. Rosenwald responded by giving Booker T. Washington some amount of money for the syphilis studies at the Tuskegee Institute, but sadly, unfortunately, his wealth was consumed in the stock market crash of 1929, and with that crash vanished the support for Macon County's economic and disease treatment program. And because of that, the United States Public Service Health stepped in to assist with the project, even though the government never agreed to share Rosenwald's goal of sustaining black health sufficiency. So basically, it's like the government coming in to say, okay, I'm coming in to help, but we are not doing this, we are not doing that, we are not doing this, we're doing this. They come in with their own requirements. Some of the writings of the Public Service Health PHS doctors revealed a lack of faith in African Americans' ability to manage their own economic health issues. Around this same time, there was a doctor named S.S. Invern, and he estimated that the national estimated syphilis among blacks was about 95%, even though there was never a clinical examination done from the African Americans. So it was just word of mouth. But another doctor, Dr. Joseph Horn, advocated for Wassermann test on African Americans, claiming that just because someone has a sore, it doesn't mean that they have syphilis. Okay? Because it was normal to see cuts and bruises on African Americans, especially those that are sharecroppers, just because of working in the farms and toiling the land. So, long story short, in 1932, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment officially begins because of the simple fact that this doctor, Joseph Horn, suggested to Dr. Taliaferro that they should not treat the syphilis patients. Instead, in order to save cost of treating the disease, they should perform an experiment by merely observing the cause of the disease in African Americans and publish the data. These public doctors fully understood at the time that blacks would refuse to come forward voluntarily to seek treatment. So they decided to entice the study subject by disguising the experiment as a treatment program that is promised by Rosenwald. These doctors knew that if the patient understood that they are being cared for, these patients will profess themselves as devoted to restoring their health, and these doctors will appear in their eyes as a godsent. The devil always wears Prada. Now, tell me, how is that different from people going on TV, okay, appealing to you, okay, to go take a jab, okay, and you can get a lottery ticket, or you can get a student loan, this, or you can get some, benefits for taking the jab, concert tickets, and things like that. How is it different? So if you know history, you will know how to move and dodge raindrops out here. You know what I'm talking about? I remember one day they say if you go take the jab, you can get, I don't know if it was Lifetime Krispy Kreme donuts or something. Yeah, that was the day I laughed. I couldn't help myself. But anyway, let's move on. Yeah, all kinds of offering was on the table a couple of years ago. Yeah. So anyway, eventually they made the announcement for the day when they are going to give free screening in Macon County. Yeah, today we're touching the Tuskegee experiment and we're going in detail. Okay. And also there was a public health nurse named Eunice Rivers. Now, remember that name because she played a great role in all of this. In some article, you will find her as Eunice Rivers Laurie. Nurse Rivers was black. Nurse Rivers noted that the clinic was overflooded with African Americans who coming in to get their blood drawn for the syphilis experiment. That same day, 316 got their blood drawn before 2 p.m. Keep in mind that most of these guys have never seen a doctor before their whole life. Okay? So, they ran various tests and at the same time lying to the patients that they are being treated for nebulous disorder, which is a bad blood, which is commonly referred to a wide array of symptoms, from anemic blood to muscle aches to parasitic infections, gonorrhea, and syphilis. Okay, they gave them some vitamins and some doses of arsenic, and those that they suspected already had the syphilis disease, they gave those patients mercury, even though mercury causes devastating side effects such as injury to the nervous system, mental deficits, hair loss, and tooth loss, and even kidney, heart, and lung diseases as well. They gave them all these doses, but they refused to give them the state-of-the-art treatment at the time for syphilis, okay, which by that time in 1932 consists of amphetamine and salvacin. So they ran the spider taps and selected 399 African Americans, 399 with syphilis as subjects. Okay, another doctor, Raymond Vandalia, who was the successor of Dr. Taliaferro Clark, he added another 200 uninfected men to the group, according to the control group. When a dozen of these 200 men end up getting infected with syphilis, okay, they transferred these men to the infected group, which itself is a violation of experimental design, because perfect separation of infected groups and control groups was necessary for any accurate and truly objective comparison of their health state. Okay, because by switching them from the control group to the infected group, these physicians were falsifying data. These switching of men and patients as well also reduced the number of men in the relatively small control groups who went on to contract syphilis as well. Another doctor, O.C. Wenger, okay, he was a piece of work. The PHS senior officer of Syphilis program said, and I quote, "As I see it, we have no further interest in these patients until they die." So basically, these men were regarded by these public doctors as living cadavers, more valuable to American medicine dead than alive. So, the story goes that this Dr. Winger was even portrayed in a book called The Fight for Life as a public health hero. Dr. Winger eagerly awaited these men's death because he claimed that the autopsy will confirm the diagnosis and the extent of injury caused by their untreated disease. And these reports will be compared with those on the bodies of control subjects to characterize in detail the ravages of syphilis. However, these doctors anticipated difficulties in obtaining these bodies for autopsies, okay? Mainly because, as we discussed earlier, African Americans resented the fact that their bodies will often get stolen and exploited for anatomical examinations. So these doctors had a meeting, and in the meeting, it was stated that they must be very careful because if the colored population become aware that accepting free hospital care means you will end up in a postmortem condition, every African American in the Macon County will leave. They said that the only way they're going to be able to get postmortems is to have the demise take place around a black doctor. Bingo! I'm just showing you to see how they always need one of us, in order to, make their narrative come into fruition. So, Dr. Eugene Dibble, who was African American, got involved. Dr. Eugene Dibble was the African American director, of the Tuskegee Medical Center. So, what they did was they helped Dr. Eugene Dibble become a government doctor, which means he's getting a raise and making more money. So you see, they always use money to, come in. And what man doesn't want to feed their family? Think about it. Think about it. So anyway, now that they have a black doctor, the African Americans in Macon County have confidence in the program. And also Eunice Rivers, who was the eldest daughter of a Georgia farmer, and who was also one of only 4 black nurses in the whole state of Alabama, was recruited from her job as a night nurse to serve as a scientific assistant. Mind you, all these names I'm throwing out, you can Google them and look them up yourself and see that everything I'm saying is actually been sourced. So she was hired to assist in procedures and examinations and to keep track of the men. So she will check on them periodically and dispense their medicines, which was mostly aspirin and vitamins. And these medicines made these men believe that they were in treatment, not knowing that they are just waiting to die. So this Nurse Rivers was very friendly. Sometimes she will drive them into town for their doctor's appointment in a shiny black car. And occasionally, she will disburse $1 or $2 to the men, and she will wait as they visited friends and marveled at the manicured lawns and painted shops of the city streets. Nurse Rivers will listen to them sympathetically and helped when she could. especially when the doctors were rude to them. Nurse Rivers was there to console them. However, the men did not know that Nurse Rivers' job was also to track them all the way to the autopsy table. And of course, Nurse Rivers did not tell them either. So these government doctors begin to fear that these men will evade them and want to go die at home. So they decide to offer free burial as an inducement. These doctors link up with an organization called the Novak Fund, Novak Fund, who had strong ties with eugenics, and they agreed to pay the $50 burial fee, for each man, which was split by the physician who performed the burial in the funeral parlor. So now at least the men are beginning to have a peace of mind, of knowing that they will not end up unburied or in a potter's field. These men were monitored so well, and most of them did not receive medical treatment for over 40 years, despite all the evolution in medicine from 1932 to 1972. They still refused to give them treatment. In 1934, these government doctors met with local black doctors and asked them not to treat the patients who are receiving care in the research studies, and the black doctors agreed. In 1941, these government doctors circulated a list of names to the draft board because they were starting to draft black people to fight in the war. I think it was the Second World War. So they were instructing physicians not to treat any men who were inducted into the army from this study group. When the United States entered World War II, Tuskegee syphilis study subjects were exempted from the draft because these government doctors feared that they will be treated for syphilis in the military. And by 1941, some of the studied participants decided to take it up on themselves to go to clinics and venereal disease treatment clinics that were dedicated strictly to the eradication of syphilis. But unbeknown to them, their names was there as well, and they get rejected, and it was understood that they should not carry those names. So most of them were physically removed. And in 1943, when penicillin was determined safe as a cure for syphilis, some of these men did succeed in circumvent the study and heal themselves. 30 of these men, which was 7.5% of them, managed to obtain an effective degree of treatment, and that began to make the doctors worry that the treatment might interfere with their study group. These doctors, trying to keep their study group going, put out a paper saying that the blacks in their study groups did not want treatment at all from any other source. But as we all know, these African American men also rely on their herbs and their home remedies to take care of themselves from time to time. As these men begin to die, the government doctors wasted no time in performing autopsies and regularly published the results in medical journals. They even shared studied results at a 1936 American Medical Association meeting, and many white physicians were informed of the studies, but not African American physicians. because the African American doctors were not allowed to be AMA members at the time, American Medical Association members. So let me get this straight, just to reiterate. You're telling me that you're using black bodies to perfect your medical, whatever it is you're doing, but you are not allowing black physicians to participate. Interesting. White people have the highest form of insecurity I have ever seen on this planet. And not only they're insecure, they're also scared of us immensely. So when I see African leaders on TV smiling and acting docile, I just can never understand that dynamic. It's kind of like putting an elephant on a chain his whole life, and then you take the chain out and you just tie a thread on the foot, and you take the elephant to the city to go parade around. The elephant never, he go up with the chain, so he always feel like the chain is there. He never try to cut the thread, because I think that is what's going on in Africa. Yeah, but anyway, moving on. A decade later, the death rate of the infected men doubled, and even Dr. Winger said, and I quote, "We now know what we could only surmise before, that we have contributed to their ailments and shortened their lives." By 1935, nearly 1/3 of the autopsied men had died. And many of the survivors were suffering its deadliest stage, its tertiary stage. 40 wives were infected, and at least 19 children were born with syphilitic birth defects. In 1958, the government doctor awarded the Certificate of Appreciation signed by the Surgeon General and replete with a gold seal to each infected man, along with $25, $1 for each year of the study. Now, imagine the global jubilation of a single injection to cure AIDS. This is the kind of exuberance that accompanied the cure of syphilis with penicillin. So, in 1965, the civil rights drama in the country played out in the medical sphere as well. The radical leftist group, Students for Democratic Society, SDS, discovered the Tuskegee syphilis study and held rallies urging for it to end, but they were easily dismissed as a fringe group. However, the question of racism in the study also surfaced within the medical fold, as Alan Brandt discovered that he found the minutes of a 1965 meeting at the Centers for Disease Control. That same year, a white physician, Dr. Aaron J. Schatz of the Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit, wrote the PHS. His letter began by saying, "I am utterly astounded by the fact that physicians with potentially fatal disease to remain untreated when effective therapy is available." But his letter was never answered. But towards the end of the year, a young Polish immigrant by the name of Peter Buxton, who was a venereal disease interviewer for the PHS, learned of the study and immediately risked his job by writing his superiors and asked that it be stopped. A handful of PHS physicians responded by holding meetings, and in this meeting they lectured Buxton of the scientific merits, of their work. At the end of the meeting, they decided to continue the study. In 1967, Buxton left the agency to attend law school. Okay, but he occasionally wrote the PHS to renew his complaints, but to no avail. By 1969, physical examinations and autopsies that as many as 100 of the men had died of syphilis and its complications. Around 1972, Peter Buxton told a journalist friend about this Tuskegee Institute, and on July 25, 1972, Jean Heller broke the story for the Associated Press, and all hell broke loose. These PHS doctors, government doctors, denied any human rights abuse. However, they also defended their work. They added that treating the men now would risk the patient's health. But of course, none of these claims were true, as amphetamine has been the standard of care when the study begins, and treating the men now would only impair the study's data. The news media, politicians, physicians, and ordinary citizenry expressed, blacks and whites expressed horrified anger and demanded an explanation from the government. Not only an explanation, but some sort of assurance that such cruelty will never again be sanctioned by the PHS. The government promised to conduct an internal review. After a while, it became obvious that all these internal investigations was not attaining anything. So Senator Ted Kennedy held a hearing. Okay, I'm going to stop here for now and continue on the next series with Senator Ted Kennedy. It's almost, this thing is almost unbelievable to, understand what really happened to our brothers and sisters. But I just want to thank you all for listening.